Hi, I'm Megan Sprague. I'm the clinical director of ABA with Hope Comprehensive. I've been a behavior analyst since 2009-ish, but have been doing this for longer than that, and have been really excited to help grow and develop Hope. And I'll let Kelsey introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Kelsey McCarthy. I am a BCBA supervisor with Hope Comprehensive. I work under the fabulous guidance of Megan. I have been a behavior analyst now for a little over or just about 3 years. I've been in the field for almost 8. I'm a sibling of someone with special needs, so I really understand some of those hardships that can happen like throughout the whole family dynamic. And I think that's a big thing that really inspired my career. So really grateful to be working with such amazing families and especially with such an awesome staff like we have at Hope.
For sure.
And by the way, I love the commonalities between the names. I think that's really fun.
But yeah, it is really cool with the Hope in there. That's probably how we found you guys. So just a little bit about what we do. Hope Comprehensive has been, it's kind of two worlds that have recently collided. I joined the field as a behavior analyst a while back, and I felt like, and I don't know if some of your families will relate to this, but I felt like autism intervention was getting a little bit too big and too corporate and too much about money and not enough about the quality of care and making sure that all of our families were really listened to and heard. And so I started my own practice in 2011 in North County, San Diego, and did that for close to 10 years, nine years and some change. And I felt like I was a little bit too far away from the magic of actually connecting, which it feels funny to say this in COVID right now, but connecting with people and connecting with kids and making sure that I was, in it and part of that mix again. I was doing all the administrative stuff and we were doing it really well, but I wanted to branch out and find another company that, kind of needed the guidance to do what I was able to do for so long and to do it the way I was doing it. And I found Hope Speech and Language Therapy and Phil and Amber, and they were doing speech and OT, and they wanted to start ABA. And it was this perfect serendipitous, I don't know, we were lucky to find each other and we just kind of merged. And so that's kind of where the Hope Comprehensive was born. And the last year or so, year and a half now, we've been kind of doing both sides of it, the speech and the OT and diagnostics and things like that, as well as building this pretty expansive ABA program. It went from just up here in Temecula to down in San Diego. We're expanding up north to the Corona area. And we're also crazy enough to be servicing 29 Palms because someone told me that nobody was out there and those people needed help. So we're doing it. So kind of the goal of our treatment and what we're doing is to make sure that we keep the heart in the services, that we're personal, and that our staff, when they're in the home and they're dealing with the kiddos and the problems that arise with, all these different kinds of diagnoses that we'll talk about, that everybody feels supported on the staff side and the client side, and that all of our staff is fully present and just really listening to what the actual needs are and tailoring our care to what our clients are needing. So I'm really proud of what we're building, and I'm excited to get to talk about it and get all fired up. But I love getting to explore these types of problems and diagnoses and challenges and triumphs that arises. So I'm excited to get to talk about it.
So this is a term that I'm sure many of you as parents, as caregivers, et cetera, have heard before. So how neurodiversity is defined is basically just differences in development, differences in behavior, et cetera, between those who are, and I have to put air quotes, traditionally developing, because what is tradition at this point in 2021? And those who may operate on a different wavelength. So children who might have different sensory needs, children who might not communicate vocally, et cetera. So this is something that applies to not only behavior, but also cognition. So learning patterns, behavior, et cetera. One of the things that I really like about looking at people on a neurodiversity spectrum is that I think sometimes it can take focus away from the diagnosis and what's wrong with this individual, and just more looks at like, okay, how are they different from how most people communicate? It makes it so it's not something that's so pathologized, which we are, of course, going to get into several diagnoses. I just really liked to explain this term to start off with because I think it's a good starting point. And it just really emphasizes that, you know, in some way, we're all on this neurodiverse range. We all function a little bit differently. We all communicate differently. And there are, you know, the classical ways of obviously just basic conversation, learning in a classroom, et cetera. But we know with some of our children, with some of our teens, et cetera, that they need a little bit of a different approach. And I really like that neurodiversity is just kind of a catch-all term that reminds us all that we're all different.
Okay, so in the umbrella of the things that we're going to talk about, they're all kind of interrelated. And I think it's called a spectrum for a reason because everybody presents at a different place on that spectrum. And an umbrella is kind of a nice way to think about it because all of these things kind of have similar ways that they present, similar challenges that we're working through, and similar ways, you know, to categorize them. So it makes sense that they're all on this spectrum. Autism is considered a bioneurological developmental disability, and if you know one person with autism, you only know one person with autism. It's hard to categorize these people and put them all in one bucket, but there are similarities. They have to have certain deficits in three certain areas, including language and stereotypy and the types of play that they're engaging in and things like that. And all of that has to be present before the age of 3 in order to receive this diagnosis. So there's lots of different approaches, there's lots of different treatments, and it feels like all the time we're hearing more and more about how to treat autism and the latest fad. But the most number one tried and true treatment is applied behavior analysis, which is what Kelsey and myself do. And also there's medical medications that will help and that kind of biological thing. But what we focus on is the behavior and the environment and creating ways to make learning happen. And I tell everybody that behavior analysis and behavior analysts, like our jobs are really individualized instruction. So even outside of what all of these different diagnoses are, our job is to go in and kind of find the holes in the learning and to fill those holes. So we start from the bottom of the foundational skills of just being able to attend and being able to be in the presence of another person touching your stuff, all the way up to teaching complex social skills and you know, those higher learning complex types of things. So mostly people on the spectrum are going to be characterized by struggles within their social world, kind of engaging with other people, allowing other people in their social oneness, and just kind of learning to navigate the world, as well as they do have some restrictive or repetitive behaviors, things that we know commonly like the flapping or some repetitive rituals or rigidity that they go through. And those are the types of things that we're working on when we're treating it. So I think the next slide talks about that, which I kind of covered a little bit. But if your child is diagnosed with autism, the first thing that you want to do is talk, well, first of all, I should say, as a parent, if you're concerned that your child may have symptoms related to autism, I tell all my moms that are nervous or they have people telling them, nah, they're okay, everything's fine, is to trust the mama instinct of, no, something's not right, and to go get evaluations. You can first talk to a pediatrician about it. And then there are psychologists and developmental pediatricians and different people that do those kinds of evaluations to kind of get the ball rolling and the discussion going. And then the first thing I recommend is to find an ABA company that you agree with kind of their philosophy, for how they want to treat, to make sure that things are individualized. Kind of all my soapboxes about what we're doing at Hope, making sure that the people are there and really listening to what you're wanting to do. And sometimes it's not the first company. So even if it's not us, there's good people out there, but you have to find the right fit for your family. So working on those types of things, and it's an invasive treatment. Typically early intervention is about 40 hours a week, which is, it's a hefty load. But if you start early and you catch things early and you just build those skills from a young age, it's a lot easier than if you wait and then you're trying to break some of the habits that have formed over the years. So ABA is the most common. There's also medications that can help treat, and also the related clinicians such as speech and OT, and we can talk more about that too with the other diagnoses. But this is the most common thing that we're working with, but all of these other diagnoses that we'll discuss are kind of interrelated with the same kinds of things.
All right, so jumping into attention deficit disorder and attention deficit hyperactive disorder, so otherwise known as ADD or ADHD. I personally, within this presentation, I didn't get too much into the difference between the two, but just looking at the definition, the main difference is one features that hyperactive behavior profile where it's really hard to remain seated. The child might be really fidgety and moving all the time. Whereas, just attention deficit disorder, there might not be that hyperactivity, but there's still that inattentiveness. So this is something that is often caught a little bit later in a child's life because they may not notice that these things are occurring with the child until they're in a formalized school setting. So until they go to preschool or maybe even, further along where academic requirements get a little bit more stringent, that's really where some of these deficits can start to pop up because that's where the child is realizing, oh, I can't sit for a 20-minute story. I don't want to play a game all the way to the end. I'm having a hard time not interrupting my teacher or my peers when I have something interesting to say, et cetera. So this is, similar to autism or really any other diagnosis. No two individuals present exactly the same, but there are some commonalities regarding, some of the things I just mentioned, not being able to keep thoughts to yourself, that some of that impulsivity. For some children, this might look like the kids who don't really have a lot of safety awareness. They're jumping off of things, et cetera, because of that impulsivity. If they want to do something, they don't really think it through and they just go right for it. The CDC defines this as actually one of the most common neurodevelopmental disorders. And this is actually, within my research, I realized this is actually something a lot of adults struggle with as well. So I think it's one of those things where, once again, until you're maybe in a more challenging academic subject or until you're in an arena where that focus is really imperative, you might not realize how impaired you are in those areas. This is something that doesn't really repair itself over time unless you have a lot of discipline or unless you have maybe you have teachers who are willing to work with you. Some of the more common symptoms are trouble maintaining attention, impulsivity, restlessness, and then other issues with executive function, which, if that's a new term for any of you, that would be a really good one to do some further research on. Some of the behaviors within executive functioning include your working memory, so remembering things as you're working through them. A good example would be, if you need only 3-4 things from the grocery store. If you're that person who goes to the grocery store and you have to have a list regardless of how many items you have, that is something that is kind of typical of that ADHD profile of, okay, it's a simple thing, it shouldn't be that hard to remember, but when I'm actually in action and not focused solely on those items I need, and I'm seeing all the lights and everything else that's in the store, I lose focus on what I actually came here for. I think that happens to all of us when we go somewhere like Target, but if this is something that happens to you across settings, this might be obviously a little bit more of an impairment. There are 3 different types of ADD and ADHD. The first being primarily inattentive, so issues with focus, finishing tasks, organizing your thoughts, putting those thoughts out there, so some of your communication. The second would be primarily hyperactive. So this is the ADHD profile, the very restless, moving around constantly, talking, very impulsive. And then the third type is just a happy presentation of the two. a lot of individuals with ADHD also cite struggles with not only what I previously mentioned, but also emotional regulation and some impulsivity regarding emotions. So feeling emotions really strongly, not responding to those very well, and then kind of after the fact, having that thought of, oh, maybe that wasn't the right way to handle that situation. As I mentioned, executive functioning is something that is particularly difficult for those with ADHD. And this is one of the things where I feel a lot of people put kiddos on the spectrum in this box of, oh, inattentiveness focus. And I've actually seen the opposite in a lot of cases where children on the spectrum, especially if it's an area of interest, they can be amazingly focused. So if your child maybe has an autism diagnosis and they, across a lot of settings, even if something's very interesting, get pulled away from that very easily, you might actually, maybe in that situation, it isn't a bad idea to get them assessed for ADHD, because that could really be a sign that even when they're interested, like something else can pull them away from that interest, that focus, that subject. So going on to the next slide. What should I do if my child is diagnosed? So my best recommendation would just be determine how and where your child is really affected by this disorder, and figure out with that, you know, if it's in school, which is a very traditional struggle for individuals with ADHD, collaborate with that school team to figure out where we can make accommodations. Obviously, an IEP might be something that could be down the line. So figuring out what within that IEP is going to be most supportive for that child. This is a disorder that is very, very commonly treated with medication. And, you know, we didn't say this yet, but we are not doctors. We never, you know, make medication recommendations or anything. We just work around whatever the pediatrician, the psychiatrist has prescribed for that child. We're just reporting what is very commonly associated with these disorders. There are often overlapping anxieties and things like that, maybe performance issues for children with this disorder. So things like counseling, talk therapy, and sometimes behavior therapy can be very appropriate for these individuals. And as I already mentioned, you know, having just basic adjustments within the settings where they struggle. So giving them extra breaks, maybe presenting assignments in different manners, giving them, you know, some accommodations such as, you know, I'm sure teachers really get frustrated with some of those fidget toys or different movement behaviors that those children require. But if those are applied correctly, they can be really supportive and helpful for that individual.
Okay, and before I jump into ODD, I just wanted to say on the topic of medication, you know, the longer I do this job, when I first got out of grad school and was ready to save the world, I was very hesitant and kind of against medication. And then the more kids that I saw with, you know, we rarely see kiddos that just have one diagnosis. We usually see them with lots. And the more that I met and the more that I saw, I realized that medication for sure has its time and its place where, you know, it is helpful. So there are some kids that we will see likely that also have an ADHD diagnosis and are on the spectrum, that I refer to as my ping pong balls. Like they're just kind of all over the room. And sometimes what the medication will do, independent of what anyone's thoughts on medicating children, it will allow them to be present for their treatment or for their therapy or for their learning. And so I started to see that and realized, okay, I need to be thoughtful about when I have big feelings about treatments, because some kiddos that are the ping pong balls kind of need that ability to just sit with themselves and breathe so that they can be present and allow us to be their teacher. Whereas without that, we're spending the whole time just trying to get them to sit in one spot. So I go back and forth on how I feel about meds. I think sometimes we're just medicating because we don't know what else to do. And I don't necessarily agree with that. But if you can find something that works for your child, you know, that allows them to be present, then the treatment can actually take place. And so there's a place for it. Oppositional defiant disorder is really, really challenging. These kiddos typically a lot of times will first maybe fall in the autism category, and then people will start realizing, wait, all the things that we're trying to do don't work. Um, they're not responding to positive reinforcement like our autism kiddos, and they're arguing everything and picking every single battle, and a lot of our tried and true methods are just not working. So these kiddos present as very defiant, and um, they usually towards like a parent figure or a teacher, and pretty much everything that you try to do that for them, whether you're trying to meet their needs the way they ask for it, or you're trying to show them a new way to do things, it is out the window. They will argue at every step. So some of these symptoms that these kiddos are working with are easily angered. They are unwilling to cooperate with authority figures, so mom, teacher, those types of things. And it seems like their behavior is coming from kind of a spiteful or vengeful situation. So you told me I couldn't go to the park earlier, so now I'm going to dump all the milk on the floor. Those kinds of things, like a retaliation. And like anything, the symptoms will vary in how intense they are from kiddo to kiddo. I actually have a colleague who's also a behavior analyst, and her daughter just got this diagnosis. And she was telling me it's battles every day, all day, for everything. Hey, I got you your favorite fruit snacks. Let me give it to you, and starts to open the package. No, I didn't want you to open it. Okay, sweet. Here's one that's not opened. Well, I can't open this, and then I'm upset about that. And she said constantly all day, that's what her day looks like. So it turns into, having to definitely learn how to pick your battles, and, to try and cope with dealing with that. Some kiddos will display their ODD in all areas of their life. It will happen at school, it will happen at home, it will happen in the grocery store, and it'll be everywhere. And some kiddos, it's just at home. I think Kelsey would agree, we have a fair number of clients that they can keep it together all day at school. And teachers will say, no, everything's great. They follow the rules. They do what they're asked. They clean up. They follow the group instruction. And then they get in the car on the way home, and everything turns on a dime, because now I'm in my comfort. I'm with my mom, who is my most trusted person, and I can't hold it together anymore. I just can't do this. And I think this can be the case with some of these kiddos, where everything just ramps up at home. What to do if your child is diagnosed? It's important, especially with this one that's kind of explosive in lots of different areas in unpredictable ways, is to learn the patterns of things that are triggering for your child. If helping them before they've asked for help is a problem, you can make note of that and try to mitigate some of the defiance that way. My friend also, she was a wealth of knowledge about ODD. She said she rarely wants to go to the counting down, like, okay, you need to pick up your shoes in 3, 2, 1. But she said for some reason that gets the little girl with ODD every time, and she complies. So there's something about that way of handling her behavior that works for them. And even though it's kind of aversive for her mama, it's getting, the job done, and they don't have to have as much arguments. So we want to look at those types of things. What works, what doesn't work, and try to figure out, how to best navigate those different moods as well as you can, to keep everybody on an even playing field. So getting help from people around you, like psychologists and psychiatrists, behavior analysts work with ODD a fair amount, and just helping to build an army of clinicians that can help understand those triggers and trying to navigate helping them to be successful. So some of the treatments that work: social emotional counseling, to help them with coping skills, and when I am feeling angry or when I do want to retaliate, things like that. There's something called parent-child interaction therapy, which I don't know much about, and Kelsey was telling me that a lot of the feedback was that it doesn't work. So we don't have to spend a lot of time on that, but that's out there for ODD. And in some cases, like I said, ABA, I think in ABA, we would probably be focusing on, um, dealing with the coping of our big emotions, also learning to kind of change some of the patterns about following directions and listening to authority, building rapport, finding the triggers, things like that. A behavior analyst can help navigate with that for sure. Also, I heard, I've had a couple clients that have read the book, The Explosive Child, which has been helpful for dealing with the kiddos with ODD, because a lot of times these are the parents that are pulling their hair out because they're like, everything everybody's telling me is backwards for my kiddo. So looking at trying the different methods and finding, the key for each kiddo is the way to go.
One quick thing I wanted to add really quickly before we move on from ODD. I've only actually had one child in the past that had that diagnosis. I don't have a lot of experience, but this was a very complex case. The child also had some medical issues. And in particular, one thing he really refused were those medical issues, which in his case, it was imperative on a daily basis to keep him healthy. So that case, the big focus was just on the parent training. So really just helping the parents, like Megan said, learn how to pick their battles. So the only thing that I really, talked to them about was like following through with those medical demands, because those were the most important, and everything else, be patient. Try to set yourself up for success, try your best not to reinforce some of these more negative patterns, but really just taking a step back and trying to establish some shared control with that child, because when they feel like they do have a say and they do have some agency over their decisions in their life, it's a lot easier for them to tolerate when they have bigger demands and things like that. So jumping into a bigger one, anxiety and depression. This is a condition that unfortunately is very common, or both of these conditions can really go hand in hand with a lot of the different diagnoses that we've already talked about, and then the couple we're going to discuss after, because children are self-aware. They realize when they don't perform at the same rate that their peers do, when they realize when they're being socially rejected. It doesn't matter whether they're vocal or not. It's something that they can sense and that they will react to. And that can obviously create some, fear in terms of anxiety, in terms of trying that same task again, trying to socialize with those same peers again, et cetera. And over time, that can lead an individual to be depressed. So this is something that is considered to be an internalizing disorder by the CDC, because this is something that typically we all have different ideas. And when you know your child, I'm sure you can sense their anxiety and see what that looks like for that individual. But that doesn't necessarily mean that their teacher or their therapist or another individual that works with them is going to pick up on those same cues. So this is one where it's really important to talk to the individual, figure out how they're processing, how they're feeling, so that you can understand the severity and where this is really stemming from and how to best support them. There's various types of anxiety disorders which can be diagnosed. The most common is generalized anxiety disorder. This is one where the anxiety is pervasive across multiple settings. Social anxiety is more something where this is regarding just non-structured social interaction. So something like school might be okay for this individual, and something like a birthday party might be what the big trigger is, because they don't know what to expect. They're not sure how to start conversations. They're not sure how to jump into games, etc. Separation anxiety is more about separation from fear of a caregiver, maybe a sibling, maybe another really preferred person. And if that individual is not in the setting with them, they don't feel secure. They don't feel like they can function. Phobias are more acute. This is really just, I'm very, very scared of, for some kids, they have a big fear of the bathroom or something like that. Potty training is really hard because the sight of that area of the home is just terrifying to them. And then a panic disorder is really those pervasive panic attacks. That's the anxiety response. That's how the individual is presenting their anxiety. They're okay and they're coping up until they're not. And certain triggers can induce symptoms such as a really rapid heart rate, shakiness, sometimes nausea or even vomiting, different common things that are associated with that feeling of a panic attack, which I'm sure some of the children that we all work with, some of the children that we love and care for, and then maybe even some of us have experienced from time to time. Some of the symptoms of pervasive anxiety or some of these disorders include just pervasive constant fear, just worrying constantly, not knowing what to expect, because of this, being unable to focus and attentive. And I think this is one of the ways that some children maybe do get misdiagnosed with something like ADHD. You know, maybe the true issue is that they're very anxious and it presents as it presents as just very inattentive, but that really isn't the issue. The issue is the anxiety in the first place. This is an individual who might avoid certain settings or stimuli or people that aren't actually threats to their safety. They're just perceived as threats. And then mentioned those panic attacks already. The CDC listed related disorders to anxiety as post-traumatic stress disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder. So post-traumatic stress is something that is triggered by previous trauma, maybe a really traumatic event. I think a lot of us really associate that with people who have come home from, you know, a deployment in the military or something like that. And then obsessive compulsive disorder is more of those repetitive rituals that individual feels like they have to keep up those rituals in order to feel safe, in order to prevent something bad from happening. And that is obviously anxiety just really running the show in that situation.
And in terms of that, you know, I would say probably the majority of people that we are seeing and treating on a daily basis, like I said, are their main diagnosis is the autism spectrum disorder. I would venture to guess, I'm not a diagnostician, that probably the majority of our clients at some point in their journey are going to also have anxiety and depression, just because they're learning how to navigate all of those big deficits in their world. And I think it's likely underdiagnosed in the population of people that we're working with. We're seeing, as behavior analysts, a lot of the symptoms of these two, as well as I would say probably OCD. We're dealing with maybe not a formal diagnosis of OCD, but I've had kiddos that had a backpack full of the things that they have to have with them at all times. And if they don't have all of those things, they can't function. And so that might not be pervasive enough to get a formal diagnosis, but we're often dealing with some of those incorporating symptoms of other things that present as part of their autism. So that's part of the reason it's a spectrum, and it's part of the reason why when you've met one person with autism, you've only met one person with autism. So anxiety happens when it's also related to the next one that we'll discuss, the sensory processing disorder. But I think a lot of our clients will have really big reactions to the public restrooms, usually because of the sound and the unpredictability of when toilets are going to flush. They have a problem with Disneyland and crowds and the unpredictability of the amount of people, where those people are going to go, and just how much they can hear and how that affects them. And so they're dealing with all those kinds of things that are too much. I think a lot of times people on the spectrum and with a lot of these diagnoses are seeing and experiencing and feeling the same things that we are, but at a heightened level, so that it's harder for them to navigate. And that's why a lot of the kids will wear like headphones and things like that. All of navigating the bigness of everything causes some of this anxiety and depression. So the depression generally involves when everything's a little bit too much. And I think we've all probably been in a place where we've been depressed from time to time, where the food doesn't taste as good and the things that I want to do, usually my favorite things, are not anymore. And just this feeling of I just can't do this. I would say depression probably would affect older clients as they get into their teen years and things like that. And they, like Kelsey said, start to realize the ways that they are different, and the things that are hard for them that are not necessarily hard for other people to navigate. I think that's a really hard time, and our clients that are going through puberty and are starting to deal with, I don't want my therapist to be there anymore because other kids are looking at me weird, and I want a date and I don't know how. And I noticed my brothers and sisters went to the university and nobody's really opening that up as an option for me. Those kinds of things start to weigh heavily, which makes sense. And so some of those symptoms might include sleeping way too much or not sleeping at all, eating way too much or not eating at all, being very volatile and irritable, feeling very lethargic. Those types of things that I think all of us have experienced from time to time, but when it's kind of leaking into all parts of your life and your interests and things like that, that's when it becomes a bigger problem. This is where I talk to families of kiddos that have certain diagnoses when they're young, because I believe very strongly that there is a problem. A lot of parents fear these diagnoses, especially autism, the A word, and they don't want to put that on their child, that they have autism, that they have these deficits and things like that. And I've seen this go very, very badly, that once they are old enough to start making the connections, if they've never had the conversation about their diagnosis, and then you have to have a tearful conversation of, why am I different? Why am I struggling so much? What's going on? And then they learn the whole story. I think it can be a really traumatic situation. And so I'm a very big advocate of starting young, and just, you have brown hair, you have brown eyes, you have autism, your shoe is a size 5, your favorite color is blue, and just really normalizing that these things are happening and why they're happening. And I'm always very honest with all of the children that I work with and their families. This is what we're navigating. This is what we're up against. This is why I'm here to help you, and it's all okay. And it's just part of who you are, and you're beautiful. So as long as people understand, and the kiddos understand and can grow into their selves and their autism and learn the things that are hard, but also how to overcome those, I think we can avoid the depression side of things. It's when we withhold information out of fear of what that might feel like, and then have them deal with that later when there are lots of things exploding, that then they're at a little bit more risk for having to have very big emotions about what they're dealing with. So higher risks of depression. When it gets scary, that's when the self-harm can happen, and self-destructive behaviors, trying to get in trouble, trying to, do bad things, and get attention in that way and feel included that way. I think people are at a higher risk for kind of falling into the wrong crowds when they're trying to get validation and things like that to fill their cup, versus, other ways to fill themselves up. So what we do is building support. Again, looking at the behavior patterns and the changes, and being aware. Parents are always pretty acutely aware if there is something that's wrong or off, and making sure that that's an open dialogue, and we're not going to get in trouble, and if you can tell me whatever's going on in there, in whatever way that you can. And then making sure that we are talking to the right people. So the psychologists and talk therapy are helpful. Cognitive behavior therapy is kind of a mix of behavioral things along with the psychoanalysis. Sometimes there's meds, obviously. Lots of people are taking that to kind of regulate some of those things going on that are making us feel sad, and making sure that everyone, that the parents have a support system to deal with all of this. We're talking about anxiety and depression in the clients that we work with, but I always extend that to the family and the caregivers that are providing help. This is a very common diagnosis for them as well. And making sure, I'm always worried about my mamas, that they're getting the respite that they need, and that they're able to reach out and talk to someone, and that they have a support system, and they don't feel like they're in this all by themselves. So making sure that there's a team of people that are helping and that we're just paying attention to any changes in what's going on internally with the clients that are dealing with these kinds of things so that we can try and work that out. So having therapy the whole time to, if we've got the ODD or the autism or the things like that, and we're trying to catch those things early and build up their skill sets to deal with this kind of stuff, then if these things ever crop up, they have a little bit more in their tool belt to try and navigate that. But also making sure that behavior analysts, we don't really deal with anxiety and depression. We can deal with coping skills. We can deal with, if there are certain social deficits that are causing some of the issue, we can work on those types of things. I had a little girl who was terrified of public restrooms, and so I spent a fair amount of time sitting on the floor of the Target restroom, desensitizing and working with it. Looking back, it's really gross, but at the time I was like, I have no other choice. We sat just by the door of the restroom and we inched our way in until we were, at that automatic flushing toilet that was the bane of her existence. Those kinds of things cause big problems for the family. They couldn't go anywhere because if she had to go to the restroom, they would have to go home. So working on those little things and desensitizing in a safe way can kind of help navigate some of these situations as well. So we would say that a behavior analyst can help with everything, but with these kinds of things, it's more, we're looking at the symptoms of them and trying to help the symptoms, but other caregivers would have to, or clinicians would have to deal with the actual diagnosis of anxiety and depression. Take it away, Kelsey.
All right. So this is the last diagnosis that we will be going over. And fun fact is actually not a standalone diagnosis. So that's actually mentioned at the bottom of the slide. That is something that's being disputed by a lot of not only families, but also clinicians, because that is something that is so pervasively an issue for some individuals. And for some individuals, that might be the most crippling aspect of their autism, of their ADHD, is that their senses are really heightened, or their senses are maybe a little bit dimmed, and it takes more for them to get the input that they need. So the way that this is defined is basically just being a condition in which your brain and your nervous system has trouble receiving and responding to information that comes through the senses. And your senses are everything. It's how you get information from the world around you, your touch, your hearing, your vision, etc. And once again, this is not going to look exactly the same in any two individuals. Some people don't have an issue with bright lights, and for some people, that's really, really distracting. Some people like really loud, awesome rock music, and some people need headphones just to tolerate something like a public bathroom. So it's never going to look exactly the same, but it has the same underlying tone of, really common stimuli or different sensory experiences that you would have in a classroom, in a public area, in a social setting are too much for you. So some of the symptoms can include, as I mentioned, either over or under sensitivities to basic things, so lights, noises. I know some individuals don't like to hug at all. I know some individuals where you have to set a boundary because they will try to keep hugging you nonstop. Some of them can also present as a little bit clumsy, not have great coordination. This could be due to them not having a good sense of where their body is in space. And ultimately, this very commonly for either end of the spectrum, whether you're over-sensing or under-sensing, can lead to difficulty with social activities. So something as simple as a playground game, a conversation, attending to a classroom, etc. And as I mentioned, this is not something that gets a diagnosis on its own, but that could change in the future. And I think the leading clinical arena for this being a standalone diagnosis would be occupational therapy. So what should you do if your clinician or someone else you're working with indicates that your child might have a sensory processing disorder? So as with a lot of the things we mentioned, this one especially, really look into what those triggers are, what those patterns might be, what is really difficult for your child. So if for them it happens to be, you know, if they're covering their ears a lot, they would probably really benefit from something like noise canceling headphones. Or maybe they're not quite ready for really, really loud environments yet. Maybe you need to kind of do some desensitizing, ease them into it. A big one that I am a big fan of is just really picking your sensory battles. So I actually had a colleague when I was in grad school who she was working towards her BCBA, and she had a son who was on the spectrum. And he was someone who definitely identified with sensory processing disorder. And one of his big triggers were haircuts, which, you know, very traditionally, boys have short hair, girls have long hair. She put that out the window. She was like, you know what? He doesn't like haircuts, and he likes having long hair, and he's adorable no matter what. So she just never pushed that issue. She just let him have his long hair. He was the one at, I think, maybe 10 or 11 years old who finally decided that he wanted to try having a haircut again. So it was one of those things, like, she avoided probably tons and tons of different issues because she just allowed him to not get a haircut for a while, which there's no shame, you know, if that's something that you really want to work on with your clinical team, or if that's something that's important to you, it might be worth it to try, you know, some exposure, some desensitization. But I think picking your battles in any arena, whether that be with your child, your spouse, your sibling, whoever, that's always going to be something that's supportive, not only for you, but also for that individual. So just making accommodations where you can. As I mentioned already, occupational therapists are really the leading arena in terms of dealing with kiddos with sensory struggles. So they do a really good job of turning these different introductions and exposures to new sensory items, things that might be new or maybe even non-preferred, in a really fun way. They do it with different proprioceptive activities like swinging and jumping. They figure out how to help that child determine where their body is in space a little bit more. And all of these can really lead to better coping strategies. And I know Megan and I both really love collaborating with OTs in terms of, okay, how the magic that you're making happen in this awesome gym of yours, like, how can we try to mimic this at home too? Because there's wonderful coping to be established when you work with them.
Also, I think working with a wide range of kiddos, I've noticed a lot of them, if you have a sensory seeking kid that really loves deep pressure or swinging or those types of things, I've noticed I've started when they're really upset, squeezes and giving them that kind of input a lot of times will help calm. Squeezes help most kids, I would say. When they're upset, I find myself squeezing their arms, squeezing their legs, and talking about it. These kids that are having trouble with the sensory stuff are the kids that can only wear a tank top and it can't have any tags in it and things like that. And so I think, like Kelsey was saying with the haircuts, it's easy to pick those battles because let's get tagless shirts and you can wear tank tops and it'll be okay. And those are little things. When they're big things, like I was talking about, the family can't leave the home, that's when we might push a little harder on trying to work through some of that sensory stuff. And I kind of put self-stimulatory behavior um, a little bit in this bucket. There are kids that we've worked with that are high frequency stimmers, and I am not. Every behavior analyst is a little different. I am not one that tries to reduce self-stimulatory behavior. Everybody, everywhere, spectrum or not, has their own. I'm a hair flipper. I had a grad professor that one time during one of my presentations counted how many times I did it, because we're behavior analysts and we're weird and we count things, and it was a lot and it was surprising, and that's my self-stimulatory behavior. And sometimes when, like I was talking about earlier, kids that hold themselves together at school and then go home and fall apart, it's kind of the same thing. If you've gotten a long amount of time where I've held myself together, I've done what you've been asking for, I might need a minute to go and flap for a second. And that's how I cope with things, and that's how I bring myself back. And those kinds of things are okay. And the more skills you learn, the less you have to engage in some of that kind of sensory, self stimulatory kind of world. But I think I'm not a fan of trying to reduce that out of kids. I would much prefer just teach them more skills so that they have more options. Um, so the next slide, how these conditions relate to each other. The answer that we've been saying over and over is they really super all kind of relate to each other. And what's hard is when, we're all different and our genetics are all different, and a lot of these things are not easily pinpointed to know, okay, right now am I working with the anxiety or am I working with the autism? I'm just working with this little boy. So it's kind of looking at how I've always been a fan of, forget what the label is. I don't care. I just want to look at you and I want to see what you're needing from me and how I can teach you to be successful. I say that with the caveat that a lot of times the A word or autism, what it does do, unfortunately, right now, is open doors to getting more services. So I tell people all the time, please don't be afraid of labels and of those diagnoses, because sometimes it just gets you access to help. So you don't have to tell everybody what the diagnosis is or that it exists. But if it's getting you access to the respite and it's getting you access to the right professionals and it's getting you access to the therapy that's needed, it's all okay. But what people should be doing is looking at the family as a whole, looking at the client as a whole, and seeing how all of these different words create the one human that we're trying to make successful in the world. So they have similar risk factors. They have similar environmental factors. A lot of the symptoms overlap and commingle. And so sometimes it's very hard to tell, that for the diagnosticians too, to figure out what they're dealing with. Some of them have a genetic link. Some of them we don't know yet. It's not as easy as Kelsey and I were talking earlier about like Down syndrome. We know where Down syndrome comes from. We can mark that on our genetic makeup. A lot of times we can't with all this other stuff. And so all of this is coexisting, and we just have to find what works best for each kiddo. So my big take home from all of that is just finding the right people that have the same philosophy for your family and your children that you do, that are caring and want to individualize their instruction to meet the needs of your learners, and that have the right background to be doing so. I'm a behavior analyst. I stay in my wheelhouse. Like I said, with anxiety and depression, I can treat your symptoms. I can't necessarily treat the cause of that. That's not my background. That's not Kelsey's background. But we can look at things that are observable and we can help you through that kind of stuff. So making sure that the people that are on your team are there and you agree with how their philosophy and how they do things, and ask questions and trust your intuition, and reach out to people when you're needing help. I think, Kelsey, do you have anything to add?
I think the only thing that I might add, I had this in my notes, was the only really like scientifically backed tie right now is that if you do have a sibling or a parent that does have a diagnosis like autism, ADHD, you are more likely to possibly have that yourself, or vice versa. If you have that diagnosis and you have a child, it is genetically a little bit more likely that you could have a related disorder. But once again, it's not something where the science is advanced enough to really track exactly a statistic number of how likely is that going to happen. So we do commonly, I have treated several siblings that one has autism, the other has ADHD, or they have a blend of both. So it's not as high as it probably will be in maybe 5 years. The research is always changing, so this is definitely a good one to continue looking into and seeing what's been developed, because it's changing all the time. And then the next slide is basically what we used in terms of resources to develop this. If you have a child that you care for, or if you have someone else you care for that has a child that they have autism or suspect it, NFAR is probably one of the best resources in the San Diego area. They have a fantastic amount of not only resources for families, but also different events and things that they do. They raise a lot of funds, they give out grants, etc. And then in the order that we presented these different diagnoses is the order in which these resources are listed. So if you'd like to learn more about ADD and ADHD, the second link would be a great place to start. ODD would be the third one, and then so forth. And then obviously it's one of those things, if you're ever wanting to look into more information on your own, Google is obviously a wonderful search engine, but it will present you a lot of different things that might not necessarily be scientific in nature or very reputable. So looking for things that, .gov.org is generally a very good way to get better information, looking at resources like the CDC, the Mayo Clinic, things like that.